Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm joined by journalist, podcaster, and founder of Feminist Current, Meghan Murphy. Meghan, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. You're someone I've wanted to talk to for a while. It's not often that I get to have like a feminist writer or someone who's kind of in that world on the show. A long time ago, I had Taya Smith, who I think is someone who identifies as a feminist, but it's been a while since I got to speak to someone like yourself. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment for anyone that maybe isn't as familiar with you that might be listening or watching. And I'm sure plenty of people are, but for those who aren't, if you could just talk a little bit about who you are and what your story is, and particularly the way I often like to frame this question is, how is it that you came to be somewhat of a controversial figure in the wonderful and always very pleasant world of online political discourse?
It's a long story, but I'll try to make it brief. So I have been writing about feminism for a decade now. I launched Feminist Current, which is my website and podcast. One of my podcasts. I have a second podcast as well. But I launched the Feminist Current podcast and website in 2012, really because I felt like I didn't have anywhere to put my writing and work. I was new in terms of journalism and new as a writer, so that is a challenge in and of itself. Just to get published and just to kind of access the journalism world is quite challenging. I was completing a master's degree in women's studies. Well, the department had changed its name to to gender, sexuality, and women's studies, of course, in the grand gendering of women's studies. And I was also completing a master's degree in journalism. My kind of feminism was not the kind of feminism that was popular at all during that time. So the kinds of things that I was pitching and the way that I wanted to talk about certain issues was not what was popular, especially in the U.S. I'm Canadian and was living in Canada at the time. Lived in Canada my whole life until this past year and a half. So places like, Jezebel, for example, which was a really popular feminist blog back then. And most of the mainstream liberal outlets in the U.S. didn't want to publish, again, the kinds of stuff that I wanted to talk about. Like I was critical of prostitution, I was critical of pornography. I wanted to talk about violence against women, which is not very fun and sexy. I was critical of like the sex positivity movement, which I thought was really stupid and not very good for women. I was critical of BDSM. I was critical of slut walk. Like I was critical of all the things that everybody wanted to talk about as a positive thing. And the way that people were talking about, the way that feminists were talking about, the mainstream liberal feminists like Jessica Valenti, Jill Flipovich, sorry. I mean, I don't even know if you know who these people are, but...
I'm familiar with Valenti.
Yeah, I mean, they popular feminism, they wanted to celebrate these very superficial things as empowering for women, and particularly things like, again, pornography and prostitution and burlesque and stripping and pole dancing and parading around in your underwear as some kind of like protest against rape culture and like posting sexy selfies on the internet. Like we were supposed to be pretending that these things were about women's liberation and women's empowerment, and I thought that these things were not empowering for women at all, which is not to say I don't think that women should be able to do whatever they want. Like, if you want to look sexy, great. Like, we all want to look attractive. Like, it's not like I can't pretend like I don't try. Obviously, like, wear makeup and, exercise and things like that. But, I mean, do what you want, but don't pretend that it's some big political movement. So I started Feminist Current. And almost immediately after I started Feminist Current, things started getting controversial around the trans debate, and I entered into that debate. At first, really, because the women that I knew and worked with, and the feminists that I had read and interviewed and looked up to, and that I felt that I'd learned a lot from in terms of what I consider to be actual feminism, you know, second wave feminism, women who'd started transition houses, women that were working with exited prostitutes, women who were working directly with like victims of trafficking and victims of domestic abuse. They were under attack because they wouldn't go along with this notion that men were women, you know, and that because these men were saying that they were women, they should be allowed to access transition houses and places where women and girls even were vulnerable, you know, change rooms, bathrooms. Obviously now the debate around trans women in sport has gotten very big. Men are being transferred into women's prisons now, but these women were under attack, and they were being harassed and threatened, and their reputations were being destroyed, and they were being no platformed. And I wanted to defend those women, and I wanted to understand the issue. Like, it, on some levels, it seems very uncomplicated to say men aren't women and men aren't women. You know, males are never female. That part's not complicated. But because I was writing publicly and speaking publicly, I wanted to make sure that I had a solid analysis around that. So I, you know, interviewed women who had been writing about and talking about these issues for a long time, including, you know, radical feminists who've been writing about this issue since the late 70s. Like, people think that this is new, but radical feminists have been talking about transgenderism and the impact of transgenderism on women for a very long time. Yeah, so, I mean, it's one thing to talk about transgenderism in a philosophical sense, which was happening a lot in academia at the time in these gender studies programs. But at around 2015, 2016 is when we started to see legislation popping up. So in 2016, Canada's gender identity legislation, Bill C-16, was introduced. And at that point, I realized, you know, this could be really bad for women, and I had to speak up. You know, I couldn't let this happen without warning people or saying something or trying to stop it. And, you know, unfortunately, there was so few people in Canada who were speaking up about this. And so I didn't have much hope that we would be able to stop it, but I thought that it was important to at least have like a feminist analysis on the record, to show, you know, some feminists in Canada did say something about this in terms of the sexism behind gender identity ideology and the danger to women's rights. So I did go and testify. I was invited to testify at the Senate against Bill C-16 in I think it was 2017 at that point, and I did manage to publish. It was very difficult to try to publish. You know, you couldn't publish anything critical. The Canadian media was treating this bill as though it was basically already done, and that the only people who possibly might have a problem with it were, you know, the fringe Christian far right, and they refused to engage with or acknowledge that there was any feminist critique or even any, you know, critique from the general public, you know, because they wouldn't really engage in the debate. I don't even think that the general public really knew what was going on. They just presented it as this legislation that should be celebrated, you know, human rights for trans people who are part of the LGBTQ, et cetera, umbrella. Therefore, it's inherently a good thing. So yeah, and after that, that's when I really became controversial.
Yeah, it seems like a big part of your story has to do with kind of the broader story of what's happened with feminism over the course of particularly the last like 10 to 15 years, kind of starting in the early 2010s, which is that a schism was created in the movement by the influence of the trans radical movement, because essentially feminists have relied for decades on the unique categorization of women as like a specific biological person, like as something that is different from men and unique from men, because that's why you would in theory need a feminist movement, because again, like you said, men are different from women, they are not women. But it was around, I noticed it starting to explode a lot. I happened to be in college at the time in 2014. It seemed like two things kind of happened simultaneously, which is that pop feminism started to get a lot bigger, but that pop feminism was very accepting of and enabling of and kind of committed to this view that a man could identify as a woman and then be given all of the same protections as a woman and be allowed into women's spaces. And I know that that's something that, you know, I was reading an essay you wrote recently, has in some ways moved you away from what we might consider the left, for whatever that means at this point in recent years. I wanted to ask you about that divide and that schism, particularly. There's sort of a couple of things I'm curious about from your perspective, Meghan, because on one hand, I wonder what percentage of, or if you think it's a majority of feminists at this point that align with the sort of your view that it's important for feminism to have, you know, natal or cisgender, whatever you want to call it, women have their kind of own unique categorization, versus that other side that thinks that you can just be a biological man who identifies as a woman. Which one of those do you think is more dominant at this point? I mean, is it that sort of more pop feminism, you know, just sort of broad woke leftist version of it? And then also, if you do think that that is more popular at this point, and from my point of view, it seems to be, why do you think that is?
I think that, I mean, this feminist label, this is why, I mean, people get confused because they think that I've, you know, denounced feminism because I've stopped identifying with various labels, including the, you know, left-wing label, including socialist, and in some ways including feminist. And it's not because I think that I'm not a feminist anymore, you know, like I still fight for women's rights. And I think that I obviously am feminist if you pay attention to my life's work at all. But I don't feel like anybody really understands what feminism means anymore. So I don't really see much point in identifying myself with a label that really has become pretty meaningless. I mean, all sorts of people call themselves feminist, but they don't defend women's sex-based rights, and they pretend they don't even know what a woman is. So I think if you talk to regular people, I think there's so many more just regular people who don't consider themselves to be political in any way at all, who are in fact much more feminist than the people who call themselves feminist. So I don't even know what would be an accurate assessment in terms of what feminists think, because it depends on who you're talking to. I think that a lot of women suddenly have found themselves angered by the trans activist movement that says that, you know, a man is a woman and that he's more marginalized and more oppressed than anyone else on the planet, and that he deserves a voice above all actual women, and he gets to define what a woman is, which is apparently nothing, and we should just all sit down and shut up. And these women are finding themselves to have become women's rights activists or advocates, despite having never engaged in the women's movement before. And I think a big part of the reason that a lot of women these days have not engaged in the women's movement or not identified as feminist is because it's become quite stupid. Like, wait, what are we fighting for again? Like, we're fighting to be free to wear, you know, high heels and call ourselves sluts, and fighting to choose to sell ourselves on OnlyFans. Like, and a lot of it just, it seems quite silly and superficial. I mean, the right mocks feminism and feminists all the time, and I think, sadly, they're kind of right to. And we can say, you know, that's not feminism, those aren't real feminists, like, we're the real feminists all we want. But in as far as if you look at, you know, mainstream media or mainstream pop culture, movies, TV, Instagram, all these like celebrities claiming to be feminists, it looks quite dumb. And it looks like a bunch of women saying, I can do whatever I want with my body. If I want to take my top off on the internet and I feel empowered, then that's feminism. But in any case, so I think probably a lot of the, and you know what? I don't even know what these women really think, because I have a hard time believing that anybody actually believes that a man is a woman. These women, these Jessica Valenti's, these women who've made tons and tons and tons of money off of feminism. Like these women, the mainstream so-called liberal feminists, I say liberal because I don't think they're actually very liberal, in America, who are very well known and who publish, many books about feminism, who are paid, tens of thousands of dollars for speaking gigs, those women will say, oh yeah, trans women are women. And I don't think they believe it. I think they're liars. I think they're sellouts, and I think they care about their bottom line. I think they care about being able to, keep making this kind of money, keep being in the in circle, the in crowd, and to maintain their careers. I mean, Gloria Steinem even, which is weird because she's made good money throughout her career. So and she's like 80 years old or something at this point, so I don't know why, at that point you would think you really would be free to say what you want, but she's gone along with this trans women are women narrative, despite the fact that back in the late 70s she spoke out against it, and then in the past 5 or so years those words were discovered by trans activists and she was hounded over it and she retracted and said, no, trans women are who they say they are, kind of thing. Which doesn't mean anything. But, so I think they say it, but I think they say it because they don't want to get canceled. I don't know if they believe it or not. I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, I have a tendency to agree with you, Megan, on the specific issues related to a lot of the transgender stuff, that it's actually hard to believe that anyone truly believes it. Like I always say that I'm someone that people who watch my show know this. I'm very broadly critical of a lot of what you might call identity politics, including whether it has to do with race, like Black Lives Matter, whether it has to do with gender identity, as we're kind of discussing. But the gender ideology stuff in particular is the one where I don't even understand how people could theoretically believe it. I mean, it was just mutually understood across the political spectrum for hundreds of years what a man is, what a woman is, that they are very different in many ways, and that those differences are important to understand and are helpful to understand if you're going to try and understand the world around you. And it's very suspicious that, as you were kind of alluding to with Steinem and others, it seems like this sort of thing reached a critical mass circa 2015, like give or take a couple of years. And all of a sudden there's this avalanche of people sort of self-flagellating when they say the wrong thing or they use the wrong pronoun, and releasing these statements whenever they slip up that are eerily similar to one another. These weird press releases where it's, I recognize that trans women are women, and I'm so sorry to have said anything that could possibly, the exact nomenclature I escapes me at the moment, but we all know what I'm talking about. These kind of statements that Rainn Wilson just had to do this recently. He's the Dwight from The Office. He said something. He made fun of the term chest feeding, and then he immediately had to release a statement the next day about how that was incredibly offensive to, trans women or whatever. And that is something that I find very interesting about this particular issue, is that it's something where the way I always articulate it is with the Black Lives Matter thing, for instance. To me, it is. I happen to be privy to information that tells me that some of that stuff is exaggerated, just based on when I think about the actual number of black people who are killed by police versus the perceived number. But it is theoretically possible that there are thousands of black people being brutalized by the police all the time. It's not theoretically possible for a man to be a woman. That's the thing I never understand, is it is really reaching into the realm of fantasy, frankly. And it's something that I'm particularly baffled by with people who are a lot older than I am. For context, I'm 27. So people who are like my age or younger kind of grew up with this stuff to some extent. For me, it started in college. For people younger than me, it might have been in middle school or high school. people who are older than me, I'm like, you went 30, 40 plus years without a touch of this stuff. And then all of a sudden, like you said, people will just flip to, yes, trans women are women. You can identify as a woman and we'll treat you as a woman. And it's very odd. And I guess to put it into the form of a question for you, I want to ask, why do you think it happened maybe when it did? Like, what was it about the period between like 2013 and 2016 that caused so much of this to accelerate? Because it seemed like it flipped almost overnight over just a period of a couple of years, which in the grand scheme of things isn't very long for this kind of cultural change. Why do you think it was that specific time period where so much of this kind of flipped?
So it's tough to say because I think that there's more than one reason why trans ideology moved from just being, a theoretical academic essay for like Judith Butler, like for a gender studies class. But I think that it came out of academia. I think that third wave feminism is to blame in part. I think that third wave feminism in academia moved away from looking at real women's lives, from looking at women's history, the history of the feminist movement, and got really theoretical. So it was no longer rooted in reality. So to talk about gender and what it means to be a woman became a popular thing to do in academia. Judith Butler was one of the people who started writing about that. I guess that would have been back in the late 90s or so. And, by the time I was in women's studies, which was during the aughts, we were talking about gender and, and intersectionality and the idea that all women weren't the same. So, you can't talk about women as a class of people. And if you aren't talking about women as a class of people, like as women as a specific group with something specific in common, then it's hard to defend women's rights. If all women are existing as individual whatever they are and they don't share anything in common across the world, then you don't really need to protect women's sex-based rights. And I think that was what was starting to happen. We were starting to get really engaged with identity politics and these ideas around privilege, and the idea that you couldn't speak about anyone else's experience except for your own. So this was really popular when I was in women's studies again. So for example, I could not, as a non-prostitute, speak critically about prostitution. You can't talk about prostitution unless you identify, and they started calling it sex work, of course. So you can't talk about sex work unless you identify as a sex worker. You can't say anything critical about strip clubs unless you're a stripper. You can't talk about women who live in third world countries unless you live in those third world countries, which that excludes a lot from the conversation, because then it's like, well, I guess you can't have an opinion about female genital mutilation anymore. And, white women started becoming the most privileged people in the universe. I know that, white men have experienced the same thing where it's like white men are the worst humans in the entire world and don't have the right to talk about anything because white men are so bad and they have so much privilege that your feelings and opinions no longer matter. And so that was happening around the identity of white women as well. And this idea of intersectionality, I think, really threw a wrench into the women's movement and the feminist movement because, women didn't have anything in common, so how could we band together as a movement to fight for anything? We weren't allowed to speak critically about the sex industry. We weren't allowed to speak critically about Islam. We weren't allowed to speak critically about any country outside of North America. And I think that when transgenderism was introduced, it kind of became the same thing. It's like, well, you identify as trans, so you're the only one who can speak about your experience, and you know what you are, and everyone else has to shut up. And I think at the same time, for whatever reason, there were adult men who were transitioning, in their 50s, middle-aged men, maybe older, and, they had this fetish, autogynephilia as it's called. They had a cross-dressing fetish. They get turned on by the idea of presenting themselves as women, as wearing women's clothing, so on and so forth. And they wanted to be accepted. They didn't want to be treated as, like, freaks. And so they wanted to justify this concept of transgenderism, and they used the gay movement, the gay and lesbian rights movement, to do that. So they glommed onto the Born This Way label. So that's how the idea of trans kids came along. It's like, some people are just born trans, and you need to accept people as they are, which is a really strange thing to say when you're talking about the idea of trans kids, and you're saying that if you're born trans, like if you're born a boy and it turns out you're actually a girl on the inside, then you have to change. Like, they're saying accept kids as they are, accept people as they are, and it's like, well, then accept them as they are. Don't tell them they have to take a bunch of hormones and get a bunch of surgeries and, like, start wearing the clothes attached to the opposite sex and grow their hair long and attach themselves to all these gender stereotypes. Like, I don't even think they realize what they're talking about. Nothing they say makes any sense, and it's often super contradictory. But yeah, I think a lot of it came out of academia and theorizing around the idea of gender, which is unfortunate, because I think that it's useful to talk about gender and gender roles. Feminists have been talking about gender roles for a really long time, since probably the 70s. And this idea that women had to be feminine and men had to be masculine, and that, women are inherently delicate and over-emotional and irrational, and because all of these ideas were used against women to keep us from having rights. Like, women can't engage in public life, women can't engage in politics, women didn't need to go to university because inherently that was not our place. We're too delicate for politics, and we're meant to be in the home, and we're inherently nurturing, so we should be at home raising kids, not out gallivanting in the streets. What did we need university for? But it really went way too far.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the ideology that you seem to be describing that was rising, around 2010 is that there are so many inherent contradictions within it and within the tactics that are used to spread it. Not the least of which is, you mentioned this lived experience fetish that they have, where everything is about, like, this is my lived experience, which is more important than any kind of clinical factual analysis of any issue. This is my lived experience, this is my truth, as they say. And the interesting thing about that, just to get back to the contradictions, is there are a few contradictions there. One is that if somebody has this lived experience and it doesn't go along with that orthodoxy, i.e., Buck Angel, who is somebody who is trans, who says things that do not really conform to the sort of trans radical orthodoxy, the gender ideology orthodoxy. His lived experience is apparently not very valuable, according to them. Like, forget about him. And then the other thing is, people who are in these sort of intersectional protected groups, like a trans person, they are free to talk about the lived experience of, say, I'm the ultimate, I'm a straight white male. So, like, I am in the category where anyone can talk about my experiences. My experiences are not that important. It's like anyone can talk about straight white male stuff. They can say, as a matter of fact, you can openly despise straight white men in a lot of places, including in academia. So there are so many contradictions within that. And I always felt like this ideology, which, you might call it intersectionality, you might call it wokeness, you might call it, there's a certain Canadian clinical psychologist who likes to call it postmodern neo-Marxism, who I know everyone listening is a big fan of. But there's, it's interesting because it seems like my suspicion of this ideology has always been that it has an agenda, which is increased levels of cultural domination. And the evidence for that is that it seems to just have an operating system where anything that is perceived as a threat to it is marginalized. So like free speech or clinical factual analysis of issues. These are things that are a threat to this ideology that we're discussing. And so they are marginalized. I mean, there's very little other reason to marginalize free speech. It's kind of an inherently good thing unless it's a threat to you. And then there are these other things that are a boon to and very helpful to the ability of this ideology and its acolytes to have continued cultural and ideological dominance in Western society. One of those things is this lived experience system where if you are a minority, particularly these highly, sacred minorities, particularly trans people, you are able to just kind of say whatever and not be checked on it. And if you're not in that group, then of course your opinion is worthless. It's just, I mean, I don't know, I guess, do you think that's an accurate way of analyzing this ideology? That's something that I've started to pick up on, is that the way you described its kind of march through academia around 2010, it always strikes me as something that has no bearings in like actual philosophy, science, morality, and like it's just this thing that wants to eat up more and more of our culture and is on this mission and has some kind of end game.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really frustrating and counterproductive ideology, and a really weird way to operate if you're pretending to be doing critical analysis, which is what they're pretending to do in these university programs, in programs like gender studies. And yet you're not allowed to think critically or say anything critical about, any idea that is attached to women of color, any woman of color, that makes you a racist. And then now that's been extended to trans people as well. That was also used to, protect prostitution from criticism as well, as I mentioned earlier. But I mean, I guess, like, we can say that it came out of postmodernism for sure. Lots of people have said that before, obviously. And it's also been adopted by the entire left, which is weird because the left is supposed to be about class analysis. And not only are they not talking about class anymore, they're all caught up in this gender and race stuff. But again, it's like there's no, I mean, how can you defend a class of people if people are all these, floating individuals that are not attached to any other group? And it's funny because, like, they talk about groups, like they talk about trans people or people of color as though they're this monolith, and then pretend that the transsexual people, because the people who are critical of transgenderism, who have transitioned, usually seem to identify as transsexual, not as transgender. But those people, as you point out, are completely left out of the conversation. And their experiences are totally ignored. Like, I know lots of transsexual people who think that this whole thing is stupid. They're like, I know that I'm not literally female. I know that I'm a male. But for whatever reason, I don't know why, I felt my whole life that I had the wrong body and that I was supposed to have a woman's body. And it caused me a great deal of distress. And so I transitioned, and now I feel better. And, if that's the case, good for you. I mean, adults can do what they want. Like, they have the right to have surgeries, or go on hormones if they want to. I think that they should be much better informed about the risks of these surgeries and of going on hormones, because it's really, really, these surgeries are dangerous and risky and quite intense, and there are lots of surgeries. The hormones have health impacts and so on and so forth. And same thing with people of color, which is like a crazy term because anybody who isn't white is not inherently the same. Like, it's, you know, people, South Asian people are all very different. Like, if we're talking, like, Mexican people are all very different. Like, within these groupings and these countries, people are quite different and have different experiences. And people within, you know, like, it's like Mexicans are racist against other Mexicans and against Asians. And, like, you know, the same thing can be said of Asian countries and so on and so forth. Sorry, I'm getting, like, way off track here. But, yeah, I just think none of it makes any sense. And it's sort of this weird, like, 1984 style effort to stop people from being able to have real conversations. Like, nobody knows what they're talking about anymore. And you can't say anything direct or true or obvious. You have to just use these buzzwords and repeat these mantras, and, you know, words seem not to mean anything anymore. You can call somebody a woman who is clearly not a woman. Like, I saw a tweet from the Toronto police last week that said, the Toronto police need help finding a missing woman. And it was this, and even in the description, and it was like the face of a dude with a beard. And he in no way looked like a woman. Like, he wasn't even trying to pretend that he was pretending to be a woman. It's not like he was, like, wearing stupid makeup, or, you know, he didn't have pink hair or anything like that. And even in the description of this guy, they were like, he has, like, dirty blonde hair and a full goatee or something like that. And it's almost as though it's designed to drive people crazy. It's like, oh, well, we don't know what material reality is anymore. We can't speak the truth anymore. And I think that it's a way to sort of destabilize people and destabilize society. And I don't know that it's some, like, organized plot or anything, but if it were, it would be quite genius.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does lead to increasingly more ridiculous scenarios playing out in our society. I mean, one particular, the spectacle that seems to have gotten the most attention, I always use the word spectacle when I talk about this stuff because they are spectacles. They're these very bizarre spectacles that appear. And one of the ones that has gotten a lot of attention has been the trans women who are biological men competing in women's sports, which is particularly bizarre to see. I mean, you might see a man, you know, lapping women in a swimming competition, for instance, and it's just a weird thing to look at. It's an ideology that, and that's not even the most ridiculous thing that could be a consequence of this ideology. We're seeing, like I said, increasingly more ridiculous spectacles as it marches on, because as we've been speaking to, it's inherently illogical. And, you know, my belief at this point is certainly that it is something that has no interest in clinical or scientific inquiry or truth seeking. This ideology has some kind of agenda. And one of the most ridiculous, you know, things that we've seen happen that's been a consequence of this, as we were speaking about earlier, has been the erasure of just the concept of a woman, to the point where recently the Daily Wire released the movie What is a Woman, which I know you're not particularly a fan of, or you have problems with the way Walsh went about producing it. But leaving that, you know, film aside, we've gotten to this point where people can't answer the question, what is a woman? Whereas years ago, they would have been able to do that. Except recently, there's been, of course, a big event that did seem to make people remember what a woman was for a moment, and that was the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which seemed to, for a brief moment, it seems to have given women's issues and a focus on women a little bit of like a resurgence. I wonder if that's something that you think might persist, or if you think that the focus on women as a specific people, as a specific sex, will sort of fade back behind all of this sort of Black Lives Matter and gender ideology stuff, as maybe some of the furor over the Roe v. Wade decision fades a little bit. Like, do you think that this resurgence, this little bit of revitalization of a more traditional view of feminism that is frankly women-centric, do you think that's something that could persist?
I think that it will persist, but I think that will persist outside of the feminist movement. I think the American reproductive rights movement, which is of course attached to the American mainstream feminist movement. I think that they have lost the plot and they have pledged allegiance to the Democrats, and that they're not coming out of that. I think that they've spent far too long calling women menstruators and pregnant people, and have attached themselves so firmly to identity politics and this intersectionality language, that I don't think that they're going to come back to women's sex-based rights. I think they're too far gone. And I mean, I don't think the Democrats want to resolve the abortion debate or the abortion issue. I think that the Democrats gain a lot from creating hyperbole and fear-mongering around abortion and abortion rights. I think they had, 50 years to create legislation protecting women's right to choose and did not. And I think that they're using this as an excuse to get votes and support, and I think they have for many years. So I don't actually believe that they care about women's rights very much at all. So I think, but I do think that women are being galvanized around this issue. But I think that they're not women who identify with the feminist movement. I think men are being galvanized around this issue, and they're men who hate feminism and think feminism is totally stupid. So I think that the important movements are coming from regular people. I mean, and the important movements are also around the people fighting for our constitutional rights and freedoms and fighting for free speech, and like the truckers convoy in Canada. Those were like regular, non-political, a lot of them were working class people, but they were just regular Canadians. They weren't politicized. They weren't attached to parties. They weren't attached to political movements. They weren't activists. And they forced not just Canada, but America too, to give up a lot of these mandates and lockdowns and irrational rules that were limiting people's freedom and rights. And yeah, I mean, I talk to so many people, and I get so many messages from people on Instagram and via email and on various other places in social media, and I talk to people at the events and talks that I do who are so angry and upset about what's happening with transgenderism, what's happening to kids, what's happening in sports, what's happening to women in prison, and what's happening to language. Again, people who are so enraged that anybody would women who are enraged that anybody would refer to them as a menstruator or a pregnant person, or pretend that like giving birth is something that anyone can do, man or woman, that's not a specifically woman thing, and that's kind of sacred, and that the mother-baby bond isn't something that's sacred to human life. And these are not feminists. Maybe they were women who were involved in feminism during the second wave, decades and decades ago, and were like, well, things seem good, so I'm moving on with my life, and are like, oh, okay, I know I have to go back to fighting. But I think it's mostly just, regular, non-political people. Some of them might be right-wing, some of them might be somewhere in the middle, some of them might be nowhere. Most of them aren't left-wing, although there are some left-wing people who've spoken up about this, just not very many. Who haven't been indoctrinated into these ideologies, and all of a sudden see a man winning a women's swimming competition, or like I saw, I guess his name is Veronica Ivy now. He was calling himself Rachel McKinnon. He was born Reese McKinnon. He was an extremely mediocre cyclist who transitioned and started winning women's races. And he was on The Daily Show last week and was telling Trevor Noah that he was female and that trans women are literally female, and that sports is a human right, which, that's not what that means. That's about fair competition. And what he's doing is the opposite of fair competition, you know? The sport is a human right is not the same as men have a right to win women's sports competitions. The whole reason why women's sports exist is so that women can compete, because they can't compete with men in the vast majority of sports because their bodies and their athletic ability is completely different and they would never win.
Yeah, my hope is that that particular issue, you know, to some extent it already has, but that it will come to a head and maybe continue to wake people up to the ridiculousness of what is going on. Because it's that isn't actually, not everything is a human right, first of all, but also it is definitely the biggest example of the thing that I think I point to it as something when I'm trying to explain to people my views on this issue. I say, here's something that shows you why I believe that this is maybe not the best way for us to view gender and sex in our society. But there's another thing I wanted to ask you about during our time that I think is very interesting about kind of your worldview from what I've seen, and that is you are somebody who is much more. The left is very supportive of and defensive of pornography, and that is something that I've noted you are pretty critical of, and I find that interesting because it's something that it's become pretty broadly accepted in society. It's kind of almost expected that most men, especially men under a certain age, are avid viewers of pornography. At least that's kind of thought of as the standard. And also it's expected of a not insignificant number of women, maybe not to the same extent, but you're very critical of it. And I think that's something that it doesn't quite get discussed enough, the impact it's having on our society when you consider how much it is consumed. I mean, as is constantly stated, the majority of the internet is pornography, or there's a lot of it out there and people are watching it a lot and it doesn't get criticized very much. I just want to ask you point blank what some of your criticisms of pornography and its impacts on society are, whether that comes from a feminist perspective or just a more general perspective. I'm interested in hearing about that.
I mean, I think that most pornography is horrifically misogynist. And I think it's incredibly degrading. I think obviously it provides a very inaccurate view of sex and women's bodies and what women enjoy and want from a sexual experience. I think that it's almost the same thing as prostitution, and I don't know why we treat it differently. You know, like, people defend pornography by saying, oh, it's just a fantasy. Like, what, you don't want men to masturbate? I'm like, nope, that's not what I've ever said. Men can masturbate, women can masturbate. That's totally okay with me. But, you know, those are real women. You know, it's not a fantasy. Those women are really being subjected to, you know, gangbangs, you know, they're being called bitch, whore, cunt, slut, worse, so on and so forth. They're being slapped. They're having, you know, painful sex. They're, you know, being choked with dicks. Sorry to use, I don't know what kind of language I'm allowed to use on your podcast. You know, they're really crying, they really can't breathe. And I know that all pornography is not that, you know, there's some pornography that's a lot more,
but a lot of it is,
but a lot of it is that. It drives me crazy when men are like, oh, it's not like that. It's like, yeah, but if you look at any porn on the internet, that's what it looks like. Like, when I'm downloading a torrent and some porn pop-up shows up, it looks like that porn. So don't tell me that that's not the norm. You know, what I see on Twitter, because apparently you're not allowed to say that, you know, men aren't women on Twitter, but there's porn all over Twitter. And it looks like that. And I mean, I think there's a lot of other problems with pornography, because I think that it teaches men to be bad in bed. And it teaches men that their pleasure is the only thing that's important in sex. And it does that in part, not just because it's saying you're the only one that matters, but because it's teaching them that women enjoy things that they don't actually enjoy. So they're doing all these things that they're presuming that women like because they're looking at porn and they're like, oh, she's getting off on anal sex. So women like that. She's getting off on choking, so women like that. And it's not true. So I think that it impacts people's relationships and, and women in particular. And because so many young women now are growing up in this culture where porn is normalized and all over the place, they feel like they have to perform for men, for young men, in the same way that these women in porn do. They feel like they're supposed to have anal sex, and they're supposed to be choked, and they're supposed to want a guy to come on their faces, and that they're supposed to enjoy being called names in the bedroom, or slapped, or hurt, or whatever. And they're thinking about how they look, because they're seeing these women all over the internet, all over Instagram. Porn isn't just in porn anymore; it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And they're thinking of themselves, they're seeing themselves through this sort of pornified lens, as though they're watching themselves from outside their bodies. And you can't enjoy sex if that's what you're doing. Like, you're not gonna come if you're thinking about how your stomach or your breasts look. If you're thinking about your performance in terms of how you look, you have to be thinking about your body and your partner's body and what you're enjoying and what he's enjoying. And you have to be able to let go and not worry about what you look like. That's how you enjoy sex.
Yeah, it's particularly odd that in many cases it's referred to as something that is not only, people will deny that it is degrading to women, which is one thing and is interesting and you kind of addressed, but the other thing is they will actually say that it is empowering to women to be engaged in even the most hardcore and aggressive and explicit of porn. Like, people will say like that is empowering to women, which is particularly strange. And I wanted to ask you not only how that could possibly be the case. I don't know if you're able to steelman that argument at all. Maybe you can't. It seems like a hard thing to steelman. But I'm also curious why the sort of woke iteration of the left that has emerged is particularly defensive of pornography. It seems to be one of their sacred cows, which is interesting because it's not an identity group. It's actually something different. It's a type of media, if you will, we'll call it. And they're very, very defensive of it. And I told you before, kind of my framework for looking at this ideology is when they defend something, they see it as having some kind of utility, as being useful to them in their quest for cultural domination. It's not been clear to me what the utility of pornography is actually to that ideology. And I wonder if you might have any insight into that, because I'm not sure why they're so defensive of it, especially when I think about how so much of it is degrading towards women. It's odd, and I wonder if you have any insight into why they're so defensive of porn.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense, because what they're defending is an industry, and a very exploitative industry. Women in pornography don't actually make very much money in pornography. People who defend pornography will argue that women make more, or they're paid more than men are. But a career in porn is very short-lived. You're used up and spat out very quickly. And then the men who own the videos and own the company continue to profit from those videos, and you do not. You just have these, horrible intimate videos of yourself all over the internet for all of eternity that you don't own and you can do nothing about. But I think it was attached, I think this idea that, porn is empowering for women and that you have to support pornography, support women in porn, they're making a choice, so on and so forth. I think it was attached to the sex workers' rights movement. So I think sometime in the 90s, and it really amped up around the late 90s and early aughts, there was a big drive to legalize prostitution, which was framed as the sex worker rights movement, and was framed as feminism. So these people who were advocating to fully legalize prostitution, and I'm in favor of decriminalizing women in prostitution. You know, I don't want women to be thrown in jail because they have to sell sex because they have no other choice. But I do think that brothels should be illegal. I certainly think trafficking should be illegal. I think that pimping should be illegal. I don't think it should be legal to pay for sex. I think it's wrong. I think it's horrifically exploitative in 99% of cases. I know that there's some women who choose it and maybe they like it, but that's not true of most women and girls in prostitution. Most women and girls don't want to have sex with strange men for money. That should be obvious to anyone with a brain.
Yeah.
But I think that sex worker rights and, you know, it's my body, my choice, you know, they took that mantra from the reproductive rights movement for the fight for abortion access, my body, my choice, and they applied it to prostitution as if it's about your body and your choice, and your free choice to allow men to, you know, these strange, disgusting men that you're not attracted to have sex with you. And I think that they applied that to pornography also, you know, like it's her choice. And if you're critical of it, you're slut shaming, which is weird because it's like, I'm not the one calling her a slut. He is. That guy in the video is calling her a slut. That man who's buying her is calling her a slut. But if you criticize the industry, you were told you were shaming and attacking the women who were in the industry, which was never true. But it was attached to that, what we talked about earlier, this idea that you can only speak about your own experience and you can't be critical of something that qualifies as somebody else's experience. You know, it's her right to do this. And women are sexually liberated now. I mean, I think that some of it probably came out of Hugh Hefner's narrative, which is that he claimed to have liberated women to be sexually free. When in reality he was producing porn for his own profit and enjoyment. But he pretended that he was the leader of the women's liberation movement and women's sexual liberation. So I think people bought that. And I think people that were motivated to legalize prostitution and who wanted to profit from the sex industry, whether that was pornography or prostitution, again, I think they're pretty much the same thing. I think that they decided to use feminism as a political strategy to do that. And I think they were successful, and I think people fell for it.
Got it. Well, thank you, Meghan, for that. I know we had about an hour, so I think I'm gonna cut it soon. But thank you for those insights. That's something I want to talk about more on my show because it doesn't get talked about a lot actually. People seem to discuss it a lot, maybe on like Twitter or whatever, just in the circles that I'm in. But that's something that I think needs to be addressed because there was kind of this atomic bomb dropped onto society when streaming pornography became a thing, and people just act like it's nothing. But I appreciate you sharing your insights, Meghan, and. Before we sign off, though, I want to give you an opportunity. Anything you want to plug or promote before we sign off for today?
Well, I do. So I mentioned my podcast, Feminist Current, but I do have a second podcast now that I started, you know, maybe a couple years ago, and YouTube show called The Same Drugs. So you can subscribe to my YouTube channel to watch The Same Drugs, or you can find The Same Drugs podcast on Anchor.fm or any of your favorite podcast apps. I also started a Substack, which is just Meghan Murphy. It's called The Same Drugs, but the link is like meganmurphy.substack, whatever those links are. I'm a little tired today. I'm sorry. I don't think my words are all coming out in the most articulate way. But I do have a Substack, so subscribe to my Substack and subscribe to the podcast. And that's pretty much all I can think of. I'm on Instagram.
All right.
I'm not on Twitter.
Thanks again, Meghan.
Banned.
Yes, unfortunately. Hopefully one day that'll change. But yes, check out Meghan on Instagram and Substack and YouTube. Thanks so much again for coming on to the show. Thanks everybody for listening and watching. Please leave 5 stars if you're listening on iTunes. Really appreciate that. Please like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. Gets the show out to more people. Really helps me out. But thank you for listening in any case, and I'll see you guys next time on the Veritas Podcast.